risks, because we spend a lot of money every year and go to a lot of work to try and make sure that we don't give you diseases and problems and costs. And we just thought it was useful just to go through some of those things, and we're very fortunate to have Peers here. Peers Davies, who's a consultant vet to Innovis here, but also lectures in Liverpool Vet School. And Peers has been involved with us now for how many years, Peers? A long time, since
just over a decade, I think.
Yeah, just over 10 years, in trying to steer us through this murky industry of trying to look for disease, mitigate it, and what we can do within it. So he's very much an authority in sheep breeding, in sheep health. The authority in sheep breeding is probably those two there. So, but yeah, over to you, Peers, if we can, and we'll go through it all.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Dewi. It's quite a nice sort of select group of people here, so to try and avoid this turning into a lecture, I'm probably going to ask for a little bit of audience participation at some points. This is not just specifically about what Innovis does, but it's a little bit of a touch on some of the interesting areas around flock biosecurity and production limiting diseases that we've been working on over the last few years. And because there's not a huge number of us here, any questions, please just put your hand up, shout them out, and we can go through it as we go. It just makes it a bit more interesting for everybody. Because if you've got a question, then almost certainly everyone else has got something similar they'd like to ask as well. So, trying to think what kind of title to give this. So I decided to call it a real biosecurity, to try and focus us away from some of the very simple, reductive ways that the industry often thinks about biosecurity. We saw a lovely foot dip as we came down from the car park, and it's a scary number of people think that biosecurity starts and ends at that foot dip. But obviously most of the risk that is posed to your flocks is actually with sheep that you buy in, rather than with any other way that it can get onto the farm. Okay, so the general theme is sort of trying not to buy in problems. So we'll talk about the diseases, and we'll talk about the most likely routes they can get in, and then what some of these diseases can do, especially the ones which are not so well recognised. So it's not a lot of talking, but hopefully a few interesting things. So to start off, when we think about biosecurity and production limiting diseases in sheep, we can think about it in terms of obvious and hidden ones. So what would be the most important, obvious diseases that you, or pathogens that you want to keep out of your flock? What do you think of when you think about those kind of diseases? Which ones?
Lameness and cod.
Cod, yeah, absolutely. Massive problem now for the industry. Most farms have now got cod. A few still luckily haven't. Very obvious when you have an outbreak. Anything else? Any other diseases? Again, very obvious ones.
Scab.
Scab, yeah, absolutely. So scab, again, massive problem, increasing problem as well. Any others?
Eye problems. Eye
Yeah.
infections.
Eye problems are a really interesting one, and one which is a pattern where we see these massive outbreaks, which then go into a sort of chronic phase. Fortunately, not so common as some of the others. I mean, one of the things which has had most publicity over the last 20 years would be anthelmintic resistant worms, and more latterly, triclobendazole resistant fluke. So massive, very obvious problems when you have drench failures. But you've also got then a range of more hidden diseases. So what would be the more insidious, hidden diseases that you might be worried about in terms of limiting your flock productivity? Any ideas?
Abortions, I suppose, Peers?
Yeah, so the enzootic abortions, Campylobacter as well. And you've got that group of diseases as well, the iceberg diseases. So these ones which are only evident in a little small number of clinical cases, but have a much larger proportion of the flock infected underneath those. So we're now going into the ones which people are far less likely to be able to recognise, are hidden, and we have to actually be a little bit more strategic in terms of how we try and identify them. And these diseases basically break down into two syndromes, two ways in which these diseases will cause you problems. So a big group which will cause wasting, condition loss, and at a more subtle early stage, reduced fertility. And then you've got border disease out on its own, very specifically with reproductive fertility impacts. Now, these are not equally likely to come into the flock by rams or ewes. So, how many of you guys are buying replacement females? Either every year or some years? Show of hands, a couple of hands. How many of you guys got closed flocks apart from rams? So, if you're buying replacement females, you're at much, much more risk, simply from a numbers game. From a numbers game in terms of the number of animals coming in, a proportion of those likely to be infected, and also the contact time that those animals have with the rest of the flock. Compared to the rams, you've got a much smaller number obviously coming in, statistically much less likely to therefore be unlucky and buy one in the disease, but also the contact time with the rest of the flock being much shorter. Border disease is the one that really sticks out as an example where the ram can be a real problem. So, how many of you guys have gone through the BVD eradication program with your cattle, or are aware of it? Okay, so you probably already know BVD and border disease are almost indistinguishable, and they can jump from one species to the other in both directions. We actually use the same lab test to detect them. The same fertility risks that you get in sheep as you get in cattle, but far less attention has been paid to border disease compared to BVD historically. So that's probably one of the first things we did when I started working with Innovis. So we instituted screening for border disease, so every ram gets screened, because the risk that you have with border disease is if a ram goes into a farm with border disease, then its immediate contact is going to be with those females during mating, and that's when you get this massive spread, and that'll show up very quickly then as a high empty rate.
And equally important, Pearce, wasn't it, was the fact that that ram could be tested, and if he was PI positive, there was an immediate link to that ram bringing that disease into the flock.
Absolutely. And that ram would be shedding virus the whole time. So in terms of ram important diseases, we would definitely always put border disease right up there at the top. But in terms of ewe diseases, it probably wouldn't be there. Others will be much more impactful in terms of your profitability and your productivity over a longer time frame. And that's where things like mydevisna and Johne's disease really come in as the major issues in terms of the ewe flock. Okay, so a bit of a quiz on how common these things are. Okay, so think about border disease. What kind of proportion of flocks would you guess are infected in the UK? Border disease. Go on. Someone have a stab at it.
10%.
10%? Any advance on 10%? I'm a terrible auctioneer, so I
Well,
can't
you can
really
take
go fast
auction
enough.
in a minute after this. Gotta be.
10%? Any advance on 10?
15.
15? Any advance on 15? Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. What about Johne's disease? You're probably, anyone with cattle, probably familiar with the idea of Johne's disease in cattle. Very much talked about, tested for. What about in sheep? How common would it be in sheep? Go on. Sorry?
50%.
50%? Maddie might have heard me before. Okay, so from a study we did now, it was going back to 2018, we did the first prevalence study. So we've got some figures now, the proportion of flocks which are infected. Okay? So the two in red at the bottom are biggest concerns. So basically 1 in 3 flocks have got border disease. That's an awful position to be in, because if you're buying in, you've got quite a high likelihood you don't have it already, but quite a high likelihood you're going to buy it in. And therefore quite a high likelihood you're going to have an absolute fertility disaster. Johne's disease is the most surprising one. So we've now done 4 different, what we call prevalent studies in the UK, where we look at the proportion of flocks are infected. And as we've gone on, since 2018 when we started, the tests we're using have got more and more sensitive. The first estimate we got was just under 60% of flocks infected. The most recent studies, over 80% of flocks infected. We've just finished a much bigger study in New Zealand as well, doing the same thing. We'll come back to the results of both of those a bit later. Again, the same, very high prevalence. The most striking thing about Johne's, though, is the difference between how common it is and how common people think it is. So we started this whole journey really with the Sainsbury's producer group back in 2013. 800 people were sent a survey. What do you think your flock's got? 2% of them thought they had Yonas. And they were rather surprised when we found out that actually the vast majority of them had it. So the question then comes into your mind, well, if I didn't know I had it, it can't have been that important. Well, we'll come back to that. But before we get onto those ones, we'll just touch on My Division. So that was the top of the list there, so projected to be between 5 and 10%. This is the one where we've actually got the best detailed information because of the way that the APHA uses blood samples collected for national surveillance screening. And they've retested them for My Division levels. And you can see you've got massive hotspots in the country where it's actually very prevalent and areas where it's much less prevalent. So Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, real hotspots. Now we're probably getting to, well, this data here is actually a few years old, so now we're probably getting to 20, 25, even 30% of flocks in those areas infected with My Division. Other areas much less, down in the single digits of flocks affected. And we're getting more and more commercial farmers coming to us going, we've got these ewes, we're stuffing feed into them and they're just too thin. So we go through all the normal things. We go through worms, we go through trace elements, we go through fluke, and they come back with mixed or rather unexciting results. We test them for My Division, and in those flocks we then frequently find very high proportions of the flock are infected. Half the flock or more infected. And this is the impact of My Division is easiest to see where you have very intensive kind of traditional mule producers creep feeding the lambs, because they can tell you year on year how much creep, kilos per lamb it's taking. And you start seeing it creeping up. So going from 43, 44, 45 kilos to finish a lamb, up to heavily infected flocks, 60 kilos to finish a lamb. Now the reason is not the lamb is infected, the reason is the ewe is infected. And that's reducing its milk yield. So I do some consultancy work for some dairy flocks as well, and that's allowed us, when we found ones which are My Division positive, to actually look very precisely at the milk yield effect. And you see when you've got My Division, milk yield drops by between 9 and 12%. Plenty to cut the lamb growth rate. And the knock-on effect then for the commercial sector, lamb producing sector, increase in feed requirements when finished, lower weaning weights. But these are all subtle things, and it's subtle because this is what it does to the animal. So these are normal lungs on the side here. These are My Division lungs. So the lungs become massively swollen and inefficient. And your lungs are absolutely essential in order to have good productivity, because you need to be able to exchange gases, you need to be able to oxygenate your body in order to be able to perform as an athlete. And these ewes are effectively athletes in the game of producing lambs and producing milk. Okay. That's just a very brief one on My Division. Back to border disease. We've got this very high proportion of flocks infected, but we've got, just as with My Division, a very efficient set of tests that we can use to keep it out. So identifying animals before you buy them in, before you bring them in, is entirely possible. You just need to do it at the right time. So you want to give yourself enough time and work out with your vet enough time to actually screen them before you buy these animals in, to avoid those problems. Okay?
Because if you're buying a ram in a sale, which a lot of people do, and bring it home, as long as they keep it isolated, they could get it tested at home, obviously, could they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this comes back to the question of quarantine. So we all know we should be quarantining our animals. I spend a lot of time teaching final year vet students, and I ask them the question, well, how long should quarantine be? And they say, oh, 3 weeks, because they've had 3 weeks on their lecture notes. The industry comes and says, oh, 3 weeks quarantine. The quarantine period is entirely dependent on what you're testing for. So testing a ram, that is actually appropriate, because you can get the results and you can know whether it's safe or not. If you're buying in replacement females, you need to get those results, and then you need to work out actually if they are positive what you're going to do with them. Even if you have a bunch of infected ewes, there are possibilities which are better or worse in terms of how you manage them. sometimes that means the quarantine period effectively extends all the way to the end of the next lambing before you then mix them with a flock. The difficulty you have with board disease and with mydevisner is we don't have a vaccine for them, so our management approaches are more difficult than they would be for some of the other things. Okay, so
Piers, I don't know if it's covering you, but what does border disease look like at farm level?
so at farm level, you're going to see a perfectly healthy looking animal, perfectly healthy. It's a good example of a hidden disease because you're not going to be able to tell from a distance. A bit different to cattle. So any of you guys who've got or seen or had in the past DVD, you would have probably seen, especially if you're running a decent sized herd, a PI animal, so a PI cow. And they'll look thin and rubbish and very poor. You typically don't get many of those in sheep because they die too quickly. So what we're worried about in sheep are the transiently infected ones, which means that actually it's a much harder disease to pick out. But what you see clinically is you have decent fertility and then suddenly you get a massive spike in your empty rate. So when board disease enters a flock, it wouldn't be unusual to get 25% of the ewes empty at scan. That's the classic first sign of it hitting flock. Then, as you go into that next lambing, you start seeing late abortions, you start seeing weakly lambs, and you'll start seeing some of the classic hairy shapers. So these lambs who are born with an excessively long, hairy, guard hair coat and shaking. But they're, again, the tip of that iceberg. The iceberg is actually much bigger. It's a bigger fertility iceberg underneath the surface. Okay? Again, if anyone's got any questions or any experiences of dealing with any of these, I'm sure it would be useful for everyone else to hear them. So if you would like, if you want to say anything, just put your hand up. Otherwise, Debbie's going to be prompting me as we go. But otherwise, we'll go on and talk about Yonis. So Yonis is probably the one that interests me the most, actually, because of that difference, that discrepancy between how common farmers thought it was versus how common it actually is within the national flock. So if you look on Google, you'll see the classic photos from Australia. So they're merinos in that top photo. Classic, very, very severely affected. It seems to be a very susceptible breed. Thin, emaciated, they look a bit like a cow with yonis. That's not really what we see in the UK. And a big reason for why farmers in the UK have such a low appreciation of how common it is because you don't get that presentation. But that doesn't mean it isn't causing us issues. So, to understand what's going on, we sort of developed a hypothesis of how we thought it was working. So, just like in calves, lambs are the ones who are infected. You can't really infect an adult or a yearling with yonis. They have to be infected as lambs. Okay? So they're infected early on in life. It'll take 2-4 years to incubate inside the animal, and then you get 3 different possibilities for a sheep. That sheep could be resistant, resilient to the infection, show no clinical signs, even actually clear the infection in time. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that you get very aggressive disease, the animal appears very unwell, some of them scour, most of them don't, lose weight and die. That's another possibility, but that's not the most important one. The most important one are the ones who are moderately affected. So the disease takes longer to have its full negative effect. And what that means is as that infection is working its way through the animal, working its way through the guts of the animal is diverting energy away from the things we want it to be doing in order to fight that infection. So it's partitioning its energy towards its immune system and away from its reproductive system, away from its udder. And at the same time, that inflammatory process is causing the guts to thicken, so they're not able to absorb as much nutrition in the first place. So now you've got energy being pushed towards the immune system and away from other things, and less energy getting into the animal to start with. And the ewes are then forced to use up their body reserves. They start to lose weight slowly, but because of how rapid the sheep production cycle is, they don't get the chance to become emaciated, because that loss of condition means they've sacrificed their reproductive system, and they are more likely to then scan as empty. And while they're doing this, they're chucking out more and more bacteria into the environment, contaminating the environment for the lambs. Okay? So you get this increased empty rate, scanning, and those ewes scan empty, they're still in decent condition, and how many of you sell those empty ewes without investigating why they're empty? They're making good money, let's just get rid of them, let's just make the money back. And how often do you actually talk to your neighbours, to your friends, about what your replacement rate is compared to others? We often talk about what our scanning rates are, because someone's given us that information on a piece of paper. It's quite easy to compare. We very rarely talk about replacement rates. And when those start to creep up, that's when we have a problem. Okay, so this is what we then looked at. We looked at the proportion of infected flocks and uninfected flocks in each age category, because we wanted to see actually how long are these ewes lasting. So on infected farms, what we see is a smaller and smaller proportion are able to make it to 3 and 4 years of age. And that means you're being forced to keep more and more replacements. So on the red line is this group of infected flocks. They're being forced to keep more and more replacements. They're running a younger and younger flock. These ewes are lasting less and less. Whereas uninfected flocks, they're not being forced into this sort of high replacement rate. And the difference is quite striking. So 22, 23, 24% replacement rate in uninfected flocks, creeping up to 30% in the most heavily infected flocks. Now, when cull ewes are making really good money, the impact isn't as bad. But when they're not making such great money, the impact is quite substantial. And that's even before you start thinking about, well, how productive is that replacement female compared to a really good 4-year-old ewe? If we can squeeze another productive year out of her, that is much, much more efficient for us. Okay? So this is data that we originally generated from studies in the UK, and we've just completed the same study design in New Zealand to see actually, well, is this just a UK problem? We found exactly the same pattern. So very closely linked to fertility performance and flock longevity. When we start thinking about longer term sustainability issues, this is a sustainability killer really for the industry. But it's something which we can deal with. So compared to the other diseases I mentioned earlier, we actually have got, and have had for quite a long time, a vaccine for yonies. So it's developed in Spain over 20 years ago, very heavily used in Australia where they had much more severe, that red box, a much higher proportion of severely affected merinos. And they've shown that actually you can control it very effectively by vaccination, along with some other management approaches to try and reduce contamination. So we've got a decent tool, and on the basis of the results we found in the UK, and the fact that most flocks have it, so my standard advice for flocks in the UK that I do consultancy for, including Innovis and the breeding partners, is to vaccinate replacements and to try and get on top of this issue as much as possible. We don't use the same approach as we use in cattle, because the cost of testing and culling and doing individual management is not cost effective compared to a vaccination approach. And obviously in cattle we don't vaccinate them because it interacts with TB test. Okay, so we're very fortunate in the sheep industry to have a reasonable option.
Has there been an increase in farmers actually using that vaccine in the UK?
There has been, yeah, there's been a slow increase over time, over the last 5 or so years of vaccine uptake. It still isn't very commonly known. We repeated the survey about how aware are people of yonies. We did it just with HCC in Wales, and the awareness then had crept up to about 20%. But still, when we've done these studies and we've tested them, most people are surprised that we've got it. I think it's a really good example of that hidden disease, because unless you look at it, unless you look at your data and you really benchmark your data in terms of things like your replacement rate against what you could be doing, then you don't really realise it's necessarily a problem. And we don't go looking for problems unless we think there's something there to potentially find. Okay.
In terms of vaccinating, Piers, because we vaccinate all our tough lambs in the breeding programme to give protection to the rams going out, what's the timeline when you need to do it?
So, because infection of the lamb is the critical bit, you've got a vaccine which is licensed to be used down to 4 weeks of age. So that's the earliest point you can do it. But in reality, we normally leave it a little bit longer because you don't really want to be vaccinating animals that you know you're going to kill. So typically what I recommend is you select your replacements at 12, 13 weeks, 14 weeks, and you vaccinate them then. So you're not wasting vaccine by going in too early on animals who are not going to benefit. But you really have to do it before they get to 6 months of age, because the older they get, the less effective the vaccine gets. So you've got a sort of a sweet spot of about 2 months, just after weaning and selection is when I normally go for it.
And it works out about £3 an animal, does it?
Yeah, about £3 an animal.
And it's a one-off for life, isn't it?
It's a one-off for life. What you're trying to do, it's not going to eradicate it. What it does is it basically gives the immune system enough information to be able to control the infection and reduce the amount of shedding, which does two things. It reduces the pressure on the next cohort of lambs, and it also reduces the likelihood that that animal is going to succumb to clinical disease itself. So it's not a vaccine that can be used to eradicate a disease, but it reduces transmission. So it's important to realise that these, because also the bacteria survives in the environment really, really well for months to years, eradicating it once it's on the farm is not going to happen.
And if I wanted to go home, or people to go home and see, to screen if they have Yonis, how would you advise they go and do that?
Yeah, so screening for Yonis is really important. As with a lot of diseases, there's ways to screen if you want to find a negative, and there's ways to screen if you actually want to find the disease. So if you actually genuinely want to find the disease, what you do is you do a fecal PCR test. We're kind of all familiar with the idea of PCR tests after COVID. We'll take a group sample, a pooled sample, typically groups of 5, and if you're running a decent sized flock, you want to do at least 3 pools of 5, and it costs £40 a pool, so £120. And through Farming Connect, this is one of the examples, things they really push for people to do as part of those technical strands within Farming Connect funding, to do this pooling and screening for Yonis disease. If you've got a really big flock, you might want to go to 4 or 5 pools. But to save money, the other thing you can do is you're only interested whether you've got it or not. So you ask APHA to screen them one at a time. And if they get a positive on the first one, they don't test the other 2. So it's only cost you £40. What you don't do is bleed animals. The blood sample is actually much cheaper individually, but is far less sensitive. So it gives you a false negative result. It's just not appropriate for screening for disease. It's only useful if you've got an emaciated animal who's in that kind of pinnacle category, severely affected animal. If for screening a flock, you have to use a pooled fecal test. And this is really important because you will get some farmers who have been sometimes advised poorly, and they'll go for the cheaper blood test, they'll miss it entirely, and then that's a total waste of money. Okay. Any questions about Yonis?
And if you bleed rams that have been vaccinated,
If you bleed rams that have been
Like ours.
vaccinated, they will come back with a very high antibody titer because of the vaccine. And you can't differentiate a vaccinated animal from a naturally infected animal. There are very few vaccines actually that you can differentiate on that basis, and all of those vaccines are cattle vaccines, things like IBR. So if you have a vaccinated animal, it's going to have a high antibody titer. But what it won't do is have lots of MAP in its feces, lots of the bacteria in its feces.
so if people go home and look at the colour tags of their age groups, the chances are if you've got Yonis, you'll have half as many 3, 4, 5-year-old ewes as if you haven't got Yonis. So you've got that as an indicator to start thinking, do I need to screen?
And this is, I think, something that we're very poor as an industry, about thinking about what the cost implications are of longevity. I mean, the dairy industry has cottoned on to the idea of increasing productive life much more than we have. But if you think about it, actually most of us would probably want to have productive ewes who we can squeeze an extra year out of without having to roll them over too quickly. But unless we start recording it and thinking about it and trying to identify the reasons why maybe they're not lasting as long as they could, then we're not going to make any progress. And those conversations and that thought process can be much easier when coal prices go down compared to when they're high. But that element is all you've got to think about. Or how much more productive is a good 3-4-year-old compared to a yearling who's going to be less productive in her first year.
But if you're buying in females, Peers, you've got a good chance, you've got a better than odd evens chance of buying it in.
Yeah,
They're going to
absolutely.
be too old to vaccinate.
Yeah, they'll be too old to vaccinate.
What do you do?
So really, this comes down to picking where you're buying replacements from. I mean, it's the old story about trying to establish links with source flocks for replacements. If you're going to run a flying flock, you want to find a flock which is generating the genetics that you want and is taking the health profile seriously. Yonis, I would say, is a very important and actually a rather straightforward bit of the health profile that a ewe lamb replacement producer flock should be looking at. So having those conversations rather than just going to the mart and buying what looks attractive, because sometimes they are the most expensive sheep. The attractive pen of cheap sheep could be by far the most expensive in the sale if you buy in something that you're not aware of. And Yonis, I mean, I've picked on Yonis to talk about in a bit more detail because it's impossible to cover all of these diseases in equal detail. It's probably the one that most people are most surprised at. But it's to try and start the conversation to get you to think about, okay, well, how should we be planning this in a more strategic way? If you want more details, we did write with AHDB a very comprehensive manual for farmers and for advisors. So that's available free on the HDB website, so you can get access to that, and there's a lot of detail on the different alternatives for testing and for control of each of those iceberg diseases. So I'd urge you to have a look at that, and if you've got any questions, then I'm always happy to have a chat either on the phone or over email. If you want to have any discussion, just give me a ring, there we can pass on my details to anyone who's interested. And it's useful for us as people working on sort of the research side of production limiting diseases to really understand where the industry is. I've obviously got contact with people I do consultancy for, but if anyone has any questions, I'm always happy to.
And Piers, if I was going to screen for Borders disease at my flock at home, how would I go about that?
On a screen for border disease, that is where we use blood screening, and what we do there is we want to see actually, especially if you're buying in replacements from multiple different sources, you want to see whether the infection is currently active. So there we test a cohort of lambs from the most recent year, and we look for antibodies there. So if we've got antibodies in the lambs which have been homebred, we know we haven't just bought in animals who've been exposed but aren't infected. So it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. When we're doing fecal samples for Yonis, we're taking adults. When we're looking for board disease, we're taking a group of blood samples from lambs in that first flying crop.
And the way we protect your flocks, our end with this, is that we know that there's been Borders disease in a few of our breeding flocks. So we PI test every single ram that we have for sale. So normally about 2,500 rams get all PI tested individually bled. So you'll get a certificate with those rams when you get them, and that's what that means, is that he ain't going to be able to pass you Borders disease. And as we've said, we make sure we vaccinate all male lambs that are coming through into winter, well, before they're 5 months old most of the time, so that the young is vaccinated again to protect all of that.
So I haven't gone into this presentation as a sort of a detailed breakdown of all of these diseases, but to sort of, we talk a lot about Young disease, a lot about boar disease. In terms of what we do for the other diseases, so we've got a screening program within the Innovis breeding partners for my division. So we screen them, adopting a similar, not quite the same methodology as they use for the premium sheep and goat health scheme, the SRUC scheme. But it's a similar scheme to try and monitor the level and identify any flocks with a problem. And then if you find a flock with a problem, there's a really well established way of culling a culling and testing to clean it out of a flock. So for my divisioner, because it's relatively uncommon, it's a very important thing to cull it out when you've got the chance.
And then normally the signs of my divisioner is, like you say, you've got those issues of performance, milkiness, but also higher mastitis levels.
Yes, high mastitis levels, and just lambs who are just not growing as fast. So your lamb crops are just not performing the way you'd be expecting, and you'll get ewes who just look poor. They might have a slightly elevated respiratory rate, breathing a bit faster, breathing a bit harder, but it's very hard to spot it. You're really looking at the overall signs of poor performance, which is, we go in to actively test every breeding partner every year, because unless you're actively doing it, it's too easy to miss it. And the other diseases there are different ways you can test for each of them, on a sort of disease by disease basis. So basically everything we can test for, I push dairy to test for, and that's the approach that I think is probably the most useful to identify them. But if you can identify them, you can do something about it.
Sometimes there are limitations to the tests, aren't there? So for example, some of you might have come across CLA, where you get the abscesses, or you can describe it much better, Piers. But the current test for CLA is quite difficult for us to quantify, isn't it?
Yeah, so sometimes tests cease to be available. So the CLA is a really good example where we used to have a fairly effective test, which no lab in the UK currently offers. So our testing options for that have declined. So now we've got a process of, if you find any with lumps, so what these lumps are is actually enlarged lymph nodes behind the jaw. So if we find any with enlarged lymph nodes, we'll swab those and identify and culture those for signs of bacteria. And in the past we have bled those. We have bled a sample of, so you get lumps back here. And sometimes at shearing it's quite useful actually, because you look for scars where those abscesses in the lymph nodes have actually burst out. So sometimes the presence of scars is something that I look for as well when we're screening for it. But as time goes on, and especially if there's pressure from the industry, then there's a market demand then for improved tests. But unless we have market demand, then no laboratory is going to put the effort into developing better tests. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, really.
I'm conscious of food ready, those are so.
That's a good question. If you were buying in new lambs, talking about Borders disease, would you test the whole group or just a sample?
Well, it depends how big the group is. So it's a really good and useful question actually. There is no single number. So what we work out is how confident we can be of finding it if it's there, based on how good the test is and how many there are in the sample, in the group that you're buying. So if you're buying in say 30, 40, smallish groups like that, to get a really high confidence, to be 80-90% confident of finding it if it is there, then you'd have to be testing at least half of that group. But if you're buying in 150, you'd probably only need to test about 30. So the proportion that you need to test is not the same irrespective of the number of animals in the group, because all you need to find is 2 animals. If it's 1, it might be a false positive. If it's 2, it's very unlikely to be. Okay? So, because the answer you're looking for is there infection in this group, not is each animal infected or uninfected, because you're going to make a decision on the whole group. Okay? And this is something that I really try and drill home to the vet students, because it's something quite hard for them to grasp. It's not just a simple number, because actually if you test too few, you're very likely to miss it if it is there, and then you're in huge problems. Because you'll give the farmer, if you're a vet in that situation, you'll give the farmer false reassurance that it's not there, they mix them, you get a massive fertility outbreak.
And if you bought a group, let's say you bought 30 ewe lambs and you found it in whatever 10 of them or something, would you have to tell them all?
No, not necessarily. I mean, you've got a few options. If you've got a small group, what you can do is work out actually, are any of them there actually spreading the infection? So the first thing we do, we've tested them on the antibody test to know whether they've been exposed. We'll lock them up for 2 weeks, and then we'll bleed again the ones which were negative. So say I tested 15 out of 30, and 4 of them came back positive. So I've got 11 who came back negative. I would go back in and test those 11. And if any of those 11 then have antibodies on the second time, shit, it's spreading within that group. You know it's active. If none of those 11 have got antibodies, you may well have bought 30 animals who've either not seen it or seen it and become immune. So actually, there are some pretty cheap ways of getting a very detailed answer, but you need to think about it in detail to say, okay, what is the question I want to answer? How can I do it in the most cost-effective way? There are also very expensive ways of getting the wrong answer.
And if you've got a vet that knows what they're doing.
Yeah, so
These are the challenges.
it takes a bit of thought. So I do regularly have discussions with vets who ring me up for referral advice. What the situation? What should we do? So we're always very happy to have that discussion because it's very useful. It's much better to have that discussion in advance rather than try to patch up a situation when it's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah, one of the challenges we've always had with all of this is that if you look hard enough for disease, you'll find it with our 11,000 ewes in the breeding program. So it's always been ready to deal with it. And we do get breakdowns. We'll get a Mydivisna breakdown, we'll get an OPA breakdown, we'll get all sorts of things, but you have to have those strategies in place to actually mitigate them so that actually can protect the customers. I suppose that's what we do. So it worries me sometimes where we go through all this rigmarole and yet I'll go to a mart and I'll actually see somebody buying sheep there without a care in the world, and you think, hell, have I just wasted all that time trying to actually make people understand what we're trying to do here for that to actually just be out the door, because otherwise you're only going to be as good as the worst sheep you bought effectively. That's what it comes down to, isn't it? Anyway, on that joyous note, Peers is here. Food is ready, I think.
It smells ready.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, you know, with BVD eradication, is there likely to be something within the sheep, like Innovis are being proactive in testing all these things for the rams, but not everyone buys something from Innovis. Is there something going to be in Wales?
There might be, and the might will depend on how the BVD eradication strategy goes. So eradication has been attempted in several different countries. It's worked fairly well in most of them, but it's never been attempted in a country which has got such a high proportion of sheep relative to cattle. So the question mark is how much spillover we get from sheep into cattle. So if you reach a point with the BVD eradication strategy where they're not able to eradicate it because we've got the reservoir within the sheep industry, then that's going to motivate them to say, actually, well, maybe we should look at the sheep industry and actually provide some funding and some organisation. Where they've done it previously, to an extent in Ireland and in Switzerland, they haven't had to deal with that, and they've managed it, and they haven't thought the sheep are acting as a major reservoir. So the question is maybe, really, at this stage.
But we'd always encourage, and I suppose that's the biggest difference from some of the overseas sort of structures. New Zealand's a good example, Australia, South Africa. That relationship between the people breeding the sheep and the people buying the sheep. People have very honest discussions, and the people breeding the sheep want to know how they're performing. And that's probably where we're missing a trick a little bit in the UK, where we're actually, everybody breed these sheep, they go to the mart and hope for the best in terms of what they get. And quite often there isn't that dialogue of actually, because really you should be able to ask whoever breeds rams or ewes, what's the status with you at home with these things? Obviously, if you go to places and say that, you either get a kicking or you'll get looked at bizarrely, won't you? Because the hell are you asking that for? But that's the level of dialogue, I suppose, those slightly more forward-thinking industries have evolved to have that direct link. And I'm not saying for a minute, because actually, Piers, sheep in a mart aren't that much of a risk, nose to nose, are they, compared to sheep coming on your farm?
Yeah, it's all about the length of time that they have exposure to transmit and the number of animals involved.
Yeah.
So
the risk really is where those sheep have come from, the farm those ewes or rams have come from, not necessarily the fact that they've gone through a mart and run up an alley nose to nose, because the contact is so low. But it's what's happening at that source farm, and the only way you can know that really is to know what that farm is thinking about stuff. So if I speak to somebody and say, what do you know about, borders disease, and they look at me blankly, I think, shit. I'm not really going to be buying there. I'm going to make sure that I test those sheep if that's the case. Because when we do see breakdowns, and we have quite a lot of customers that have come to us, because they've had those breakdowns, it's not an easy one to get through, you know, because you have this churn. It's a bit like having a bad lambing or an abortion stall. It has quite a big impact psychologically as well. So keep it out wherever you can. So, and we'll help you where we can. So.